fully understand what's happening. And then finally, construct validity. Did we actually measure the construct that we think we measured? And with respect to the validity issue, they talk about these different types of validity, or these different validities have been developed because they're going to be appropriate in different situations. In some situations, we might not be able to test, or we might not be able to assess certain types of validity, and so we'd have to rely on one or the other. So criterion validity, sometimes it's simply called predictive validity. And that's if we're measuring some construct related to an event that might take place or behavior that's going to take place. And keep in mind, this could also be past behavior too, if we're asking about trips in the past 12 months. Retroactive sort of validity. And so if we can actually then measure the behavior or event or some proxy of it, then it would become an issue of criterion validity. So using predator control again, if we wanted to predict support for a certain policy, let's say it was going to be asked in an election, or maybe instead of predator code, we'd say the Clean Water Initiative, that was 2 years ago. If we wanted to survey people to ask if they were going to support or oppose one of these initiatives that might be on an election, we'd come up with some result. Then we would be able to see how close the results were to the election. So that's an issue of criterion validity. We would have some behavior that we could use to validate the results of our study.
But you don't always get those, do you? Because sometimes you can have something that people will later vote on, and you can see whether or not your survey actually predicted it, but
right.
A lot of times you might not necessarily have, or is
it? Right. Yes, I mean, it might be like an issue a lot, but we might not always have that criterion to use as the measure to establish it with. Is that what you're asking? And so, on the previous slide, I said sometimes we can't always measure these things. So maybe we have these, like this mild value orientation issue we talked about. It's saying that should predict participation in hunting and viewing. Maybe we could ask about that on a survey and sort of establish some sort of measure of criterion validity. Because sometimes then we would have these issues where we wouldn't have that actual criterion. So then we'd have to look towards other issues. So sometimes we can assess this. Are you guys familiar with the concept of willingness to pay in resource economics? So there was one study that, someone else has looked at this, but it had to do with the tax for a recycling program in Oregon. And so they conducted an assessment of people's willingness to pay for a similar program. And then they could use the actual vote on this tax as a measure of criterion validity for that study. And so the issue being, are measures of willingness to pay meaningful, or are people just always saying $20? And so that study used criterion validity to say, okay, we asked people what they'd be willing to pay through this method of seeing what actually put out a vote. We have evidence that they were truthful in those responses. So then that kind of goes into this assessment of validity. We never say that something's valid or not valid. It's always sort of a process of trying to figure out if we're measuring what we're measuring. But it's one piece of evidence of whether or not willingness to pay studies are valid.
Which I guess if you're doing like a willingness to pay study or something along those lines, you have to, from what I've read, is that the respondents need to understand, or need to believe that their response actually makes a difference. Because if this, like, if they don't think their response actually anybody's paying attention to,
Right.
they might say, oh, sure, I have a willingness to pay of $100.
Right.
And put it down. So, how would, I don't know, I guess how do you know truth?
What we have to do is just build evidence for it or against it. So, in that willingness to pay issue, so that study where they actually had a vote on something, then they could have one type of assessment of validity that would be one piece of evidence of, okay, did the results of what people said, did that correspond to an actual behavior? Okay, so then we could look at that as evidence of validity. There's other types of studies that we could look at as well. There's different methods to get at that issue. So willingness to pay is supposed to represent consumer surplus, right? And so you could use contingent valuation to ask people if they'd be willing to pay some amount, or you could use like a travel cost method. If you could apply those two methods for the same good, contingent valuation is what's commonly referred to as stated preference, because you're just saying that you pay some amount. Travel cost is referred to as a revealed preference. It relies on actual behavior.
So you sort of triangulate?
Yeah. So that'd be another piece of evidence or not, validity of the method. And some people have done like big meta-analysis of studies that have looked at both of those at the same time and said, okay, it looks like there's validity there. So I don't think we'd ever know, but we would just have to say, do we have sufficient evidence of things that we're measuring people's willingness to pay? And we'd always be seeking new evidence. I don't think we'd ever say, okay, we don't need to look at that issue anymore. Another thing that we can look to, content validity, it's a slightly different form of validity, and that's where we're wondering if we're adequately measuring the meanings included in the construct. So we define our construct, we ask the questions, and what we're wondering is, are the questions that we ask adequate to measure that construct? So, I've been using the example of predator control throughout this presentation, but using it kind of loosely because there's a lot of different aspects of predator control that we probably could look to. And you had mentioned that when you had that attitude scale, that your response might depend on certain situations. So we might have different, if we want to really understand something like predator control pretty broad, we might have to ask about a wide variety of methods of predator control that could be used. So what content validity is asking is, okay, we have this construct that we define, sometimes in this presentation I've used aerial shooting, sometimes I say predator control. Predator control is this really broad thing, so if we want to understand that, are we asking everything that we need to